By 1902, a single seam of gold-bearing rock outside a dusty South African town had reshaped the balance of the world's money, and almost no one outside a small circle of financiers and colonial officials fully understood how or why. The Witwatersrand reef, the rand to the men who worked it, held reserves that dwarfed anything California or Australia had produced in the gold rushes of the previous half-century. Above it now flew the Union Jack, planted there at a cost of 2.5 years of war, tens of thousands of lives, and a bill that had emptied the British Treasury's patience along with its coffers. A few thousand miles north, in a wood-paneled office on a narrow London lane called St. Swithin's Lane, sat a banking house that had quietly attached itself to nearly every stage of that gold's journey, from the ground it came out of, to the ingot it was cast into, to the price stamped on it each morning in the city. Johannesburg itself, barely a decade old, had already grown into a boomtown of stock exchanges, mining house headquarters, and imported champagne, a raw industrial city dropped onto the high veldt because of what lay beneath it rather than anything that had ever grown on top of it. The house was N M Rothschild and Sons. The man at its head was Nathan Mayer Rothschild, first Baron Rothschild, known to friends and rivals alike simply as Natty. He had not fired a rifle in South Africa. By most surviving accounts, he had not wanted the war at all. And yet when the guns finally fell silent at Vereeniging in May of 1902, it was Rothschild credit that had helped keep the British war machine solvent, Rothschild capital that sat beneath the continent's largest mining combine, and within 2 decades, a Rothschild boardroom that would set the price of gold for the entire world, every business day for the next 85 years. This is the story of how a war fought, officially, over the political rights of foreign miners became one of the most quietly profitable episodes in financial history. It is the story of how the family that had once financed Britain's armies against Napoleon ended up holding the deed in all but name to Africa's richest reef, and how the man who signed the checks may have wanted, more than almost anyone else in London, for the whole thing never to happen. In the Rothschild archive in London there sits a loan agreement, dated 1887, no longer than a few pages, its language as dry and procedural as banking documents tend to be. It committed £1 million, an enormous sum, equivalent to well over 100 million today, to a mining amalgamation scheme in a colonial backwater most Londoners could not have located on a map. The signature belonged to Natty Rothschild. The ambition behind it belonged to a sickly, 34-year-old former Oxford dropout named Cecil Rhodes. That single loan did more than fund a diamond monopoly at Kimberley. It stitched Rothschild's fortunes to a man, a company, and a stretch of territory that would, within 12 years, drag the British Empire into the most expensive war it had fought since Waterloo. A war that, once won, would leave the House of Rothschild sitting closer to South Africa's gold than any government on earth. So the question worth asking is a simple one. Why would one of the most cautious, risk-averse banking dynasties in modern history quietly bankroll the man who set the whole chain of events in motion? And why, when the moment came to actually go to war, did that same house seem to want no part of it at all? The story begins 9 years before the shooting started on a farm called Langlaagte on the open grassland south of Pretoria. In 1886, gold turned up in the surface rock in quantities nobody in South Africa had seen before. Within 3 years, the tent town that sprang up around the discovery, Johannesburg, had a population in the tens of thousands, and by 1898 the Witwatersrand was producing roughly a quarter of all the gold mined on Earth in a single year. This was not a gold rush in the old sense, prospectors panning a riverbed. The Rand's gold was locked in hard, low-grade quartzite that ran for miles underground, and getting it out required deep shaft mining, industrial crushing plants, cyanide processing, and above all capital on a scale no lone prospector could raise. Within a decade, a handful of mining finance houses, financed heavily out of London and largely by figures already known to the Rothschilds, controlled the overwhelming majority of production. That capital came with strings attached, and those strings ran straight into Pretoria politics. The Witwatersrand sat inside the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the South African Republic, generally called the Transvaal, an independent Boer state governed by President Paul Kruger, and a legislature elected almost exclusively by the descendants of the original Dutch, French Huguenot, and German settlers who had trekked into the interior decades earlier. The foreign-born miners, engineers, and financiers who had built the gold industry, the Uitlanders, Afrikaans for outsiders, soon outnumbered the enfranchised Boer population of the Transvaal by a wide margin, in some contemporary estimates by nearly 2-1, yet under Kruger's residency laws most of them could not vote at all. They paid the lion's share of the Republic's tax revenue. They had no say in how it was spent. By contemporary British estimates, Uitlanders were contributing somewhere in the neighborhood of 9/10 of the Transvaal Treasury's tax revenue by the late 1890s, while holding in practice none of the seats in the Volksraad that decided how it was spent. Kruger, for his part, had watched a poor pastoral republic transform almost overnight into the site of the richest gold reserves on the planet, and he had no intention of handing political control of it to men he regarded as an occupying commercial army in all but uniform. By 1895, that tension had curdled into conspiracy. Rhodes, by then both Prime Minister of the Cape Colony and Managing Director of the British South Africa Company, backed a plot to smuggle an armed column across the Transvaal border under Dr. Leander Starr Jameson, timed to support an uprising of Uitlander conspirators inside Johannesburg. The raid launched on the 29th of December, 1895, with roughly 600 men. It was intercepted and forced to surrender within 4 days. The promised Johannesburg uprising never materialized in any serious form. Rhodes was finished as a colonial statesman, forced to resign the premiership within weeks. Kaiser Wilhelm II, seeing an opening to embarrass Britain, sent Kruger a congratulatory telegram for repelling the raid, a message that detonated a genuine diplomatic crisis in London and hardened British opinion that Germany had designs of its own on southern Africa's gold. To understand why a loan document like that even existed in the first place, it helps to understand the man who signed it. Nathan Mayer Rothschild was born in London in 1840, the eldest son of Lionel de Rothschild, who spent 11 years fighting for a parliamentary seat he had legally won and was repeatedly barred from taking, because as an observant Jew he would not swear the Christian oath then required of every MP. Parliament finally amended the law in 1858, and Lionel became the first Jewish member of the House of Commons in British history, a decade-long institutional fight that shaped how the whole family understood power in London. Something earned patiently, seat by seat and charter by charter, not seized. Natty inherited leadership of N M Rothschild and Sons in 1879, and in 1885 became the first Rothschild and the first Jewish peer of any faith elevated to the House of Lords. By the time Cecil Rhodes came looking for diamond mine financing in the late 1880s, Natty presided over arguably the most powerful private banking house on earth, a firm whose credit had underwritten British government borrowing continuously since his grandfather's generation financed Wellington's campaigns against Napoleon. Where Rhodes was a gambler by temperament, a man reportedly fond of saying he would annex the planets themselves if he could reach them, the Rothschild reputation, cultivated across 4 generations, ran the other way entirely. Caution, diversification, and almost pathological aversion to putting the firm's capital anywhere it might not come home again. That the two men ended up in business together at all says something about how badly Rhodes needed Rothschild's money, and how confident Rothschild had quietly become that Kimberley's diamonds, whatever happened politically in the region afterward, were not going anywhere. The financial numbers kept climbing even as the political temperature did. Transvaal gold output, which had been worth roughly £1.5 million in 1888, was worth over £15 million a year by the eve of the war, a tenfold increase in a decade. Kruger's government, flush with new customs duties, rail tariffs, and above all a state-granted dynamite monopoly that forced every mine on the Rand to buy blasting explosives at prices well above the world market rate, ran budget surpluses that funded a modern arsenal purchased largely from Germany and France. Mauser rifles, Krupp and Creusot artillery stockpiled specifically against the possibility of a British war. London, meanwhile, escalated its own pressure. In 1897, the Colonial Office sent out a new High Commissioner for South Africa, Sir Alfred Milner, a committed imperialist who arrived believing, and said so plainly in dispatches home, that British supremacy in South Africa could not coexist indefinitely with an independent, gold-rich Boer republic on its doorstep. By May 1899, with Uitlander petitions for enfranchisement piling up on Milner's desk, he sent London a dispatch that would itself become notorious. He described the Uitlanders as living in a state of permanent political servitude, reaching for the language of ancient slavery to make British intervention feel not just justified but urgent. Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain used the dispatch to help swing a skeptical cabinet toward a harder line, and it was on that footing that Milner and Kruger agreed to meet face-to-face at Bloemfontein, capital of the neighboring Orange Free State, to try to settle the franchise question before it settled itself with rifles. The Bloemfontein Conference opened on the last day of May 1899 in the modest presidential residency of the Orange Free State, and it lasted barely a week. Milner arrived with a fixed position. A 5-year retroactive residency qualification for Uitlander voting rights, non-negotiable, take it or leave it. Kruger arrived willing to make concessions. He offered 7 years, then under pressure, edged toward 5, but he wanted guarantees in return. An end to British claims of ultimate suzerainty over the Republic, a promise that London would stop treating Transvaal sovereignty as conditional. Milner would not give him one. Kruger, then in his 70s and nearly blind, sat through the sessions in a plain black coat, occasionally removing his spectacles to press his fingers against his eyes while Milner, 3 decades younger and immaculately correct, laid out British demands with the unhurried patience of a man who already knew how the meeting would end. By the 4th day, according to those in the room, the exchanges had turned openly hostile. Kruger, by several contemporaneous accounts, broke down at one point, striking the table and telling Milner, in essence, that it was not the vote the British wanted at all, it was the country. Milner, for his part, wired London that continuing the talks was pointless, that the Republic was merely stalling for time to finish arming. On the 5th of June, he adjourned the conference unilaterally. Kruger returned to Pretoria, having offered nearly everything London had asked for on paper and secured nothing in exchange. By September, London had quietly doubled its garrison in South Africa to roughly 20,000 men, while the 2 Boer republics mobilized close to 40,000 mounted burghers of their own, armed in no small part with rifles and field guns bought with gold mining tax revenue. Kruger had been stockpiling for exactly this contingency. 4 months after Bloemfontein collapsed, on the 11th of October, 1899, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State declared war first, launching preemptive strikes into Natal and the Cape, a Boer opening move that would let London frame the conflict, for public consumption at home, as a war of self-defense rather than conquest. Set against this entire chain of events was a very different kind of story, unfolding quietly and without a single politician in it. In 1886, an itinerant Australian prospector named George Harrison had wandered onto the landlocked farm, dug a test pit, and found the outcrop of gold-bearing rock that would turn out to be part of the richest reef ever discovered. Under Transvaal law, he was entitled to peg a claim, which he did, and then, within weeks, sold his rights for what most surviving accounts put at around £10, a sum that would not have covered a single month's rent on the mansions that would soon rise on the proceeds of that same ground. Harrison then vanishes from the historical record almost entirely. Later accounts placed him prospecting elsewhere in southern Africa, his eventual fate uncertain, swallowed by rumor rather than documentation. He is, at most, a footnote in the story of the Witwatersrand, the man who found it and walked away with nothing. His claim, and the thousands like it pegged in the following months, were rapidly bought up, consolidated and refinanced by a small circle of mining finance houses with names that recur throughout this story. Wernher, Bate & Co. Consolidated Gold Fields, the corner house group controlled by Alfred Bate, Rhodes's closest business partner and not coincidentally, another man with deep, long-standing credit lines to Rothschild-linked banking circles in London and on the continent. Harrison's £10 became, within little more than a decade, an industry capitalized at scores of millions of pounds sterling, an industry whose largest shareholders sat on the same boards, dined at the same clubs, and financed the same political lobbying groups, the Chamber of Mines, the Reform Committee, the South African League that pushed Whitehall toward war in the name of Uitlander rights that men like Bate and his partners had every commercial incentive to champion regardless of their sincerity. The prospector who found the gold and the bankers who ultimately profited from it never met, never corresponded, and existed, in any meaningful social sense, on opposite ends of the empire. He is remembered, if at all, by a small plaque and a street name in modern Johannesburg, easy to walk past without a second glance. They are remembered in the account books of some of the largest fortunes London had ever seen. And yet the ground he abandoned for a handful of coins is precisely the ground the entire preceding sequence of loans, raids, conferences, and ultimatums was fought over. Here is where the story complicates itself, and where the easy version, a banker orders a war to seize a goldfield, starts to come apart under its own weight. The surviving Rothschild correspondence from 1899, much of it examined at length by the historian Niall Ferguson in his study of the family's finances, does not read like the private papers of a man engineering a conflict for profit. It reads like the papers of a man dreading one. Natty Rothschild had extensive personal holdings in South African mining shares. De Beers among them, and a war in the Transvaal threatened to disrupt production, spook the London stock market, and drag his firm into underwriting an expensive, uncertain conflict at a moment when Rothschild's core business, sovereign lending, foreign exchange, the deliberate cultivation of stability, depended on precisely the opposite. Contemporaries described him urging caution on Chamberlain and other ministers in the weeks before the war broke out, not egging them toward it, and Ferguson's research suggests Rothschild genuinely feared that a prolonged conflict could unsettle the London money market at a moment when the firm had heavy, illiquid exposure to South African mining equity. It could not easily sell without crashing its own position. This was not, by any documented account, a banker rubbing his hands at the prospect of a payday. It was closer to a man watching a fire spread near a warehouse he had already filled with his own inventory, unable to do much more than hope it burned itself out before reaching the walls, while knowing, all the same, that if the walls did catch, his firm would still be the one the government called first to help pay for the rebuilding. And yet the moment war was declared, N M Rothschild and Sons did exactly what it had done for every British government since the Napoleonic Wars. It took its customary place inside the syndicate of merchant banks underwriting the Crown's war borrowing. When the Treasury floated a war loan in 1900 to help cover the spiraling cost of the conflict, Rothschild Capital was part of the machinery that placed it with investors. Treasury records from the period show Rothschild taking its customary share of a loan issue that ultimately raised tens of millions of pounds for the war effort across 1900 and 1901 alone, priced and placed with the same institutional machinery the firm used for any other government borrowing. The firm that had reportedly counseled against the war profited in the most routine and unremarkable way from financing it anyway, because that was simply what the House of Rothschild did when Britain went to war, regardless of who inside the family had wanted it to happen. The contradiction is not that Rothschild secretly wanted the war and financed it. It is that Rothschild's fortunes were structured to benefit from the outcome whether the family wanted the war or not, through the mines it had already financed before a shot was fired, and through the government credit it would always be first in line to underwrite once one was. Intention, in the end, turned out to matter far less than position. The war that followed cost far more than anyone in London had projected at the outset. Official British government estimates put the final bill at roughly £217 million, several times the original budget. And at its peak, Britain had close to 450,000 troops in the field, the largest overseas force the empire had ever deployed, to subdue two small agrarian republics with a combined white population smaller than that of a mid-sized English city. Around 22,000 British and Empire soldiers died, the majority not from Boer bullets but from disease in overcrowded camps and hospitals. Boer combatant losses numbered in the low thousands, but the true catastrophe of the war fell on civilians. To break the Boer commandos' guerrilla campaign after the conventional fighting ended in 1900, British forces under Lord Kitchener adopted a scorched earth policy, burning farms and crops and herding Boer women, children, and elderly men into what the British themselves called concentration camps. Roughly 26,000 Boer civilians, the overwhelming majority of them children, died in those camps from disease and malnutrition, a figure documented in detail by the historian Thomas Pakenham and confirmed by British parliamentary inquiry at the time. A parallel, far less publicized network of camps held black African laborers and their families displaced by the same campaign. Modern scholarship, drawing on the work of historians including Peter Warwick and S.B. Spies, puts black civilian deaths in those camps at somewhere between 14 and 20,000, a toll that received almost no attention in Britain for the better part of a century afterward. The mines themselves came out of the war short of labor, and the Reconstruction government under Milner solved the problem by importing roughly 60,000 indentured laborers from China between 1904 and 1907. Housed in fenced compounds under conditions harsh enough that the phrase Chinese slavery became a genuine political scandal back in Britain, helping sweep the Liberal Party into power in the 1906 general election on a platform that included ending the practice. When the Treaty of Vereeniging ended the fighting in May 1902, the Transvaal and Orange Free State were absorbed as Crown colonies, folded 8 years later in 1910. Into the newly formed Union of South Africa, a self-governing dominion built on a franchise system that excluded the overwhelming majority of the country's black population from political power almost entirely, laying institutional groundwork that would harden, decades later, into apartheid. The Witwatersrand goldfields, now under unambiguous British administrative control, resumed and then dramatically exceeded their pre-war output, and South Africa spent most of the 20th century as the single largest gold producer on Earth, at its peak accounting for roughly 2/5 of global supply. And in 1919, 17 years after Vereeniging, the London gold market formalized a daily ritual that would anchor world bullion prices for generations. London gold fixing, at which representatives of the city's leading bullion dealers met twice a day to set a single benchmark price. The meeting was held from its inception in the offices of N M Rothschild Sons at New Court, and it was a Rothschild representative who chaired it continuously for the next 85 years, until the bank withdrew from the gold market altogether in 2004. For most of the 20th century, in other words, the price of gold pulled substantially from a reef that a war had been fought to secure was decided, each morning, inside the same building that had helped finance the mining company that first exploited it. That price, in turn, underpinned the gold standard Britain clung to through 2 world wars, the Bretton Woods system that replaced it in 1944, and the reserve central banks around the world still hold today, a chain running from a £10 claim on a Transvaal farm to the vaults of modern monetary policy, with a single London address sitting near its center for most of the distance in between. I want to be careful here because it would be easy, and it would flatter this channel's whole premise, to tell this story as a straight line. A scheming banker wanted South Africa's gold, so he financed a war to get it. That is not what the historical record actually supports, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to a genuinely more interesting truth. Natty Rothschild's own correspondence argues against him wanting this war at all. The war's actual causes were numerous and contested among serious historians to this day. Milner's ideological conviction that British paramountcy in South Africa was non-negotiable, Chamberlain's domestic political calculations, Kruger's own intransigence, and his very reasonable fear of losing his republic's independence entirely if he yielded an inch. Genuine, well-documented grievances among Uitlander residents who paid enormous taxes with no political voice, and an unstable regional balance of power that Germany's intervention after the Jameson Raid had made considerably more dangerous. Historians, including Ian R. Smith, who spent a career examining the war's origins, have shown just how difficult it is to reduce this conflict to any single cause, financial or otherwise. Mining house lobbying was real and well documented, but it operated alongside imperial strategy, settler politics, and plain nationalist stubbornness on both sides, not as some hidden puppeteer pulling every string in isolation. It's also worth being direct about something else. The idea that Jewish financiers secretly orchestrated the Boer War for profit is not a theory this channel is discovering. It is over a century old, and its most influential early version, the economist J. A. Hobson's 1900 book on the war's origins, framed it in explicitly anti-Semitic terms that professional historians today rightly treat as prejudice dressed up as analysis, not evidence. The actual documented Rothschild story is more mundane than that old conspiracy theory, and honestly more interesting. Not a secret cabal steering the British Empire from the shadows, but an ordinary, well-connected banking house whose ordinary business practices left it extraordinarily well-positioned when a war it hadn't sought turned out to be fought over an asset it had already financed years earlier. What the Rothschild story actually demonstrates is something quieter and, in its way, more disturbing than a conspiracy. A financial institution does not need to want a war or plan one or even approve of one to end up structurally positioned to benefit from it, as long as it has already spent a decade making sure its capital sits underneath whatever the war turns out to be fought over. That, in the end, is the uncomfortable lesson buried in a £1 million loan document signed 12 years before anyone fired a shot. Empires do not usually announce their financial architecture in advance. They build it quietly, loan by loan, concession by concession, years before the politicians and the generals arrive to fight over what that architecture happens to be sitting on top of. Nobody has to conspire for capital to end up in the right place at the right time. It only has to be patient and diversified and willing to finance whichever side of a frontier turns out to hold the reef. The money rarely drives the war in the way the popular imagination wants it to. More often, it simply arrives first, waits, and collects the deed regardless of who wins, which may be the more unsettling version of the story, because it means there was no villain to catch, no single hand to point to. Just a pattern that has repeated in one form or another on almost every continent where something valuable has ever been found underground. In the copper belts of Central Africa, the oil fields of the Middle East, the lithium flats of South America. The names on the loan documents change. The underlying mechanism, patient capital finding its way beneath whatever the next frontier turns out to be, does not. That is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. The empire's histories tend to remember the generals and the presidents. They remember Kruger's tears at Bloemfontein and Milner's ultimatums and Kitchener's camps. They remember almost nothing about the ledger sitting quietly underneath all of it, and that omission is not an accident of memory. It is, in its own way, the whole point. If this is the kind of history that interests you, the quiet financial architecture sitting underneath, the wars we're taught to remember as purely political, put the single word reef in the comments below, and I'll pull the sourcing for a follow-up on how the 1919 gold fixing actually worked, hour by hour, inside that Rothschild boardroom. And if you want the rest of these stories as we dig them up, subscribe. There's a great deal more buried in this particular stretch of ground than any single textbook chapter has ever had room for.